Muy buenas tardes a todos. El día de hoy estamos en nuestra segunda sesión, la segunda parte de nuestra segunda sesión de Neurosurgical COLLOQUIUM o coloquium neuroquirúrgico, un proyecto llevado por la SOPEN y el profesor de neurocirugía, el Dr. Guiseppe Lanzino. El día de hoy tenemos nuestra segunda parte sobre cómo escribir y redactar artículos científicos. Sin duda, pues es un tópico para el estudiante, residente o médico senior de la actualidad, ¿no? Entonces, para poder llevar un poco mejor la conversación, el día de hoy vamos a utilizar nuestro lenguaje académico en inglés. So, good morning, everyone. Today we are in our beloved neurosurgical colloquium, a project carried out by SOPEN and Professor Guiseppe Lanzino. We greatly appreciate the support of Professor Lanzino towards the Latino community. Today we have the part 2 of our second session of writing scientific manuscripts. And so, Dr. Lanzino, we are so happy to have you here with us. You can start anytime you want.
Thank you. Thank you. And sorry, last time we had to go through some of the slides a little bit in a rush. So what I do this time, we have more time. I don't have any surgeries pending for the rest of the day. We can briefly go through the material that we covered last time, and then go through the other parts of the lecture. So as I said, the key to success when to write a scientific manuscript is really to keep it simple. And the other key message is that, there is always this, you get an idea, you become very passionate about your idea, you start to dig into the data, but it's very important before you start, it's to do your own work, and in particular to review the literature, to find pertinent literature, to read it. Then after you have read it, go back and you study and you start looking through the fine print, so that before you start a project, you have a very good idea, a clear mind about what is the important material, important data that you have to look at. Now, the other basic concept is that scientific writing has certain rules, and in a way, a scientific manuscript has a fairly well-defined scheme. And once you understand and you follow that scheme, writing becomes much easier. We talked about the title and what the title means. And then when we were talking about the introduction, we stressed a couple of focal points. What's the purpose of the introduction? Is to make the reader interested in what you are about to say, and to justify the rationale for your study, basically telling the reader and indirectly the prospective reviewer of your manuscript why you did what you did. And the other important thing is to understand that the introduction has a specific structure, and that's a structure of a funnel. And what that means that you start with the single broad statement. Remember, a mistake that people often made is that the introduction is not meant to be a review of the literature. So in the introduction, you are not supposed to provide an extensive review of the literature, but basically state the purpose of your work. So the structure is that of a funnel. You start with a single broad statement, and then you progressively narrow down the focus. And the final sentence is that you say, in the current study, we did this. Implicitly saying we did this to fill a void that we had identified in the existing literature. When you follow this scheme, the introduction really, and you understand the introduction, it's not meant to be an extensive review of the literature. Really should not take more than 1 hour, and you should not take more than 2 paragraphs to say what you need to say in the introduction. This takes us to the material and methods, and we talked about the material and methods being a very important part of a manuscript. As a matter of fact, when I'm reviewing a scientific and medical manuscript, often I go directly to the material and methods, and I carefully read and review the material and methods to understand if what the authors did is sound, makes sense, because if the material and methods are not sound, then the results don't really mean too much. And in the material and methods, of course, material and methods are a critical part of a true basic science manuscript, because there the idea is that anybody who reads that manuscript should be able to do the same experiment that you conducted and should be able to come up with exactly the same results that you had. For our purpose, where usually we write about clinical material, clinical experiences, then the material and methods are also relatively simple, because basically all you need to do to put in writing in a sequential and organized form exactly what you did it and how you did it. That takes us to the results. And the results, we stress the fact that it is important to, the results section, it's not meant to be a phone book. In other words, the text is not supposed to be a mere list of all the numbers that form the results of your study. Therefore, it is important to organize the results in a logical fashion. It is important to understand that really in the results, at least in the text, you need to focus on what is the meat, what is the main message of your study. And truthfully, in a scientific paper, really, if you have three important truly new messages, that's already a lot. So that's the part that you want to stress in the text. And then in the results, you need to report all the pertinent numeric observations and results of your study, but you can use, for that purpose, you can liberally use figures and tables and graphs to illustrate your results, and also to list in an accompanying table or in a figure a lot of the information that it's not necessary to spell out in the text. Now, like the material and methods, the results part, if you really have done the work, this part should not take long at all to write. A few practical observations about how to report your results. If you say we had, let's say you're talking about ruptured AVMs, and you say 20 AVMs were in the 20 ruptured AVMs were in the frontal lobe. Well, that doesn't really mean too much, because 20 or what? So every time you have a numerical result, make sure that you offer a denominator and a percentage, because if you say 5% of the ruptured AVMs were localized in the frontal lobe, well, that gives me a much better idea than saying 20 AVMs, 20 ruptured AVMs were in the frontal lobe. So that's a very important practical point to remember and to follow. This brings to the discussion. So, to recapitulate, and I think that's what we covered the last time we arrived to this point. So to recapitulate, the title basically tells the reader what's the message of your study. And the title has become very important nowadays in the setting of these AI algorithms that it's, how you structure the title and the use of keywords that will determine whether or not, when somebody's doing a library search on the specific topic, whether or not your study comes up or not. Then the introduction, we stressed the fact that it's not meant to be a complete review of the literature, and that it has a funnel structure in which you tell the reader why what you did is important. And then material and methods is basically you tell the reader how you did your study. And then the results is what you find, and the importance of minimizing the amount of information that you put in the text, stressing in the text the most important, the numbers that refer to the most important message of the results section, and then utilizing tables and graphs to summarize and to report in detail all the numbers that constitute your results. So now we are at the discussion of a manuscript, and the discussion also has a formula. Basically, in the same in the first paragraph of the discussion, you in a way summarize the most important messages in your paper. And let's say we're talking about a series of 400 ruptured AVMs, and you can start saying in a consecutive single center series of 400 patients who presented with the ruptured AVM over a period of 20 years, we found that. And you go on with the most important findings. And as I said before, it's really if we look from a practical point of view in a scientific medical manuscript, if you have 2 at the most 3 important messages, that's already, you have achieved already a lot. So the first paragraph, you summarize your findings, and then you say why what you found is important. Then in the second part of the discussion, often the second paragraph, then you provide a review of the pertinent literature in relation to your findings. And therefore, you compare your findings with other similar papers. Going back to our hypothetical study of 400 patients with the ruptured arteriovenous malformations, you can say that Smith and co-workers in a smaller series of 250 patients seen between 1990 and 2010 found that the percentage of patients with ruptured AVM localized in the frontal lobe was 15%. And then you explain why you think that these other investigators have found such a percentage that is completely different from the 5% that you observed in your study. So very simple example to basically stress the fact that in the second part, in the second paragraph usually of the discussion, you review the literature, comparing your results to other similar observation, and explain why you might have achieved, in some cases, different conclusions, even though the original purpose of the study was similar to others. And then like this part often, this part of the discussion, often you can, once you identify what basically you integrate your conclusion with the current knowledge, then you might often identify some knowledge gaps. And you might say that future studies should focus on understanding why there are so wide geographical differences, for example, in the incidence of ruptured AVMs localized to the frontal lobe. And then the last part of the discussion focuses on the limitation. Every study has limitations. And if you are you are able to critically assess your own results, you should know the limitations of your study, the limitations of your material better than anybody else. Now, when you list the limitation, it's also important to try to counteract some of the statements that you make with a sentence that somehow mitigate the strength of some of these statements. For example, if you say main limitation of our study is that it's a single center study, and thus any single center study suffers from referral bias, then you can mitigate by saying, nevertheless, it provides a snapshot of contemporary management because we really focused on the last 10 years. So you can have, you stress what are the limitations of your study, but at the same time, whenever possible, you can have a mitigating subsequent sentence to blunt a little bit the effect of some of the statements that you make about the limitations of your study. And then we talked is that, this is also something that is usually part of the second part of the discussion. What, if anything, comes next based on your findings? And it's also something that you can briefly incorporate in the conclusions. Now, let's have an example here about the discussion. So let's imagine that we are writing a manuscript on MRA versus catheter angiography to follow aneurysms after coiling. In our study, we have found that MRA is as good as catheter angiography to identify aneurysm residual/recurrence. So how are we going to structure our discussion? Well, paragraph 1 could be, in this study, we demonstrated that as compared to conventional angiography, MRA is as accurate in detecting aneurysm remnants. These findings are important because patients might be followed without the need for ionizing radiation or the small periprocedural risk associated with invasive catheter angiography. So this is basically your teaching point and the purpose of your study. Then we go on, paragraph 2. If you remember, in paragraph 2, we compare pertinent literature with our findings. Previous authors, using retrospective analysis in small case series, have noted equivalence in accuracy between MRA and conventional angiography. Our study adds to the current literature by providing a large prospective blah, blah, blah. So here in the second paragraph, what you do, you state what previous authors have found, but you also mention the fact that they used a retrospective while your study is prospective, and that used a relatively small case series. And yes, it is true that they found that also have noted that it's MRAs as good as conventional angiography, but those studies were retrospective and small, while our study adds to the current literature. We're not saying anything novel. Somebody else had said it in smaller retrospective studies, but we can say our study adds to the current literature by providing a large prospective study to corroborate these findings. So you stress what are the important parts of your endeavor. Now, in paragraph 3, then we list the limitation, and we say our study suffered several limitations. First, readers were not blinded. Second, inter-observer variability was only moderate. So you have to be honest in the limitation section, so that if a reviewer said, well, your readers were not blinded, you can, in a revision phase, you can say, yes, it is true, the readers were not blinded. We have mentioned this limitation among our limitations of the study, basically telling the reviewer, say, yes, we are aware, this is unfortunately, it's a limitation of our study. And so, you know, reviewers are, if I had to review this paper, I would say, well, as the author themselves acknowledge, this is not the readers were not blinded, so there are some potential biases, but the reviewers itself, you know, the reviewer themselves cannot be too harsh, because it's something that you yourself have already recognized. So the discussion, it's actually that part of a manuscript that is a little bit harder to write, because you really, it's true that follows a scheme, but it's also that part that where you really need to organize yourself. Well, for example, the material and methods, you can organize in a temporal sequence, basically by saying in a temporal sequence exactly what you did and when you did it. The results, you can still, yes, you still need to organize the results section, but you need to, you can organize based on, you know, relatively simple criteria. The discussion is something that you really need to work very hard, and you really need to make it, to organize it, but also make it as much as possible that is somehow coherent, makes sense, while at the same time make sure that you are updated on the most pertinent literature about this particular topic. Because it's so important in the discussion to be logical and organize it, you can use, if you need, you can use subparagraph using, for example, italics and subheadings. Again, at the end, what you need to do in the discussion, you cannot, do not resist the temptation to go on and discuss something that is not really one of the main focus of your paper. And remember that the purpose is to discuss the main findings of the study and how these findings relate on to the existing literature. One of the benefits of writing in English is that English is you can be very clear. You must avoid long sentences. In English, a sentence should not really be longer than 3 lines at the most. So as much as possible, you can break a long sentence into shorter ones. You need to be clear and specific. So the discussion is one of those parts more than others of the paper where you read it and you reread it and you change a word and then you go back, read again, and you go back to the original word, and so back and forth several times. Again, it's important, nobody better than yourself knows what are the true weaknesses of your work, and make sure that you recognize clearly. At the same time, make sure that you emphasize the strengths, and make sure that your conclusive remarks are in line with your hypothesis and objective, and as much as possible, try to restrain from emphasizing parts of your results that were not necessarily the main focus of your paper. Now, when I start writing, I thought that the discussion to be good had to be long, but it doesn't really matter. It's, it should not really take more than 2, maybe 3 double-spaced pages. Now, what you should not do in the discussion is don't start the discussion with an extensive literature review. Even the discussion, it's not meant to be a extensive review of the literature, but it's basic. What you need to review in detail, it's the pertinent literature, especially the most recent one, as it pertains to your specific observations and the new findings of your work. Do not restate the introduction in the discussion. The introduction and the discussions are 2 separate parts of your paper, each one serving a different purpose. Don't restate your full results. Just as I said, the 2 or the most 3 main teaching points. And again, do not go into different tangents about something that was not really the focus or the main objective of your study. Again, here to stress that in a medical manuscript, if you have 2 at the most 3 teaching points, you already have a lot of material, and you have already achieved a lot. So remember, people are busy. So to be clear, to be succinct, not to go into pedantic, extensive reviews, it's important. And space comes at the price. Now with the ability to publish online is becoming less and less important, but really the time of your reviewers is limited. So the more compressed is your message, the better it is. Too many times I see that people try to do their best to write very extensive discussions, a very extensive manuscripts where you can compress and you can say the same thing in much fewer words. And actually, what I learned one time, one of my papers was accepted with revisions, and one of the revisions asked was that I was over the very strict word limits for that specific journal. And what that forced me to do, that forced me to reread my own paper with the idea that I had to cut every single word that was not truly necessary. And by doing that, I learned that it's actually really a very good exercise. It's a very good, when you have your paper ready, to go through it with the idea that you need to cut as much as possible, and you really eliminate everything that is redundant, everything that is not true necessary. Now, if you remember, I spoke about I covered the different parts of the manuscript, of a scientific manuscript. I did not say anything about the abstract, because what I learned is that the abstract becomes very easy to write. You don't need more than 5 minutes. Once you have your introduction, in the introductory statement of the introduction, or the objectives, or rationale and objectives. Nowadays, every journal has a structured abstract. In that first part, you can pretty much, once you have the introduction, summarize the introduction in 3 lines. The next step is the material and methods, and there you can really summarize in the abstract in 2 sentences what are the most important parts of your material and methods. And then in the results, again, you have in the abstract, you can just cover those 2 or 3 important messages, important findings of your study. And then the conclusion, it's really nothing more than repeating the conclusion that you have at the end of your discussion. So writing the abstracts, once you have the paper, is pretty straightforward. Make sure that the results of the abstracts correspond to the results of the manuscript, because it's not uncommon to find the numbers that don't really match perfectly. So the abstract, once you have written your paper, it should really not take that long at all. So as far as some practical pearls about the abstract, follow the rules. The most important one is make sure you stay within the word limit. The introduction in the abstract can be fairly brief, as I said, no more than 2 sentences. Nowadays, I think it's the rule to mention the IRB in the methods on the abstracts. In the abstract, you must mention statistically significant values and use the p-values. And again, as I said, the conclusions must be pertinent to the data and to the main observations of your paper. Now, if I think how I read my papers nowadays, I must admit that there is so much literature that for the most part, I scan the titles of a journal, identify the papers that I particularly interested in, and of those papers, I really read the abstract, and in the abstract, for the most part, I read the material and methods and results. And then based on the topic and the impact of the results, then I select, based on the abstract, I select the few papers that I actually end up reading in full. So it turns out that nowadays, I think the abstract has become probably the most important part, practically speaking, of your manuscript. We talked about avoiding redundancy. One of the most common mistakes is to repeat in the discussion what you have said in the introduction. Make sure that you are clear and you understand what belongs to the methods and what instead belongs to the results. And especially for the results, use freely and extensively tables, figures to summarize the main results of the papers. It's okay to use well-known acronyms. For example, in our field, SAH, ICH, MCA, UIA for unruptured intracranial aneurysms, but be careful not to use or make up new acronyms, because then it becomes very, if you have to read the paper, remember, nobody has a lot of time nowadays. And if you have to read the paper and every time you run across an acronyms that you have made up, you have to go back and find the very first time that specific acronyms was used, because you have forgotten, and then becomes very painful. It becomes incredibly difficult to read this. So it's okay to shorten and to use acronyms, but use only the ones that are widely accepted and they're widely well known to your peers. Don't resist the temptation to make new ones just because you are describing something new and you want to give it a shorter name, because that's going to get, more likely than not, the reader, but also importantly, the reviewer lost, and will make the manuscript much more difficult to read. Now, if you get a paper that is well written, there is no question that goes more easily through the review process, because a paper that is well written, it's easy to read, and sometimes the message might not be extremely novel, but reviewers are more likely to be benign toward the paper that they liked, because they could easily read it, was easily to understand, and they could easily understand the points that the authors were making, and everything corresponded. There is no redundancy. The numbers match very well. So it really gives you, as a reviewer, a different feeling. And as I mentioned before, if you really want to learn after you think about some of these things that we have discussed, then all you need to do really is to study, read critically a few papers in the New England Journal of Medicine or Lancet, and you will see that most of the papers, they will follow the schemes and the rules that we have talked about. And again, once you go and try to write your first manuscript, it will make the process much easier and much more likely to be successful. Now, remember what I said. I said at the beginning, I thought that you had to write a very long paper to be successful paper, but you just need to write as long as you need to say what you need to say. Hard to believe. This is the description, Watson and Crick description of the double helix of the DNA, and you can see it's it's like not even a full page with, I think, like 6 references. So brevity. And this is probably one of the most, not probably, for sure, it's one of the most important scientific manuscripts ever published. So don't need to be to go on a dissertation to be successful. And when you write a figure, resist the mistakes that was made here. The legend has to be cannot be too detailed. The legend of a figure is meant to quickly visually illustrate one of the main points of your paper, and therefore the legend must be also short and succinct. Don't make the mistakes to write a full dissertation in the legend, because that's not what the legend of a figure is meant. Be careful with the plagiarism. Nowadays, most journals they run every submission through a software, and this is something that can easily destroy your career from the very beginning. So be careful. And do not copy material that has or sentences or paragraphs from literature that has been published before. In the figures, one of the best advices I was told by a radiologist was, do not assume that in the reader sees in the figure what you see. What that means just because you see it, do not assume that it's so immediate to the reviewer. Remember, most reviewers nowadays are quite superficial when they read, and therefore use arrows largely when you want to focus, when you want to stress something about a figure. The references, there is really not a magic number. Make sure you have all the permanent residents, and reviewers, they are very careful. They if they don't see one of their paper, you're writing about something that whoever is reviewing the paper has written before, and they don't see their work cited, well, that's something that's even subconsciously leaves the reviewer with a little bit. So make sure that you are comprehensive and that you give adequate credit to people who have published on the same subject. Now, this is something that, people ask me, say, oh, how can you be so productive when you find the time to write? And it's really that, at least for me, a manuscript is not a specific time that I sit down, but actually a lot of the work happens while I'm walking, as I'm driving, and it's always going back and forth. And when is a manuscript done? When is a study done? Well, for me, is that the manuscript is done when you have submitted. It has come back usually with revisions. You have done the revision, and it's accepted. That's when I think a manuscript is done. And particularly figure legends, references, they can take quite a bit of time. But at the same time, these are, now the references with EndNote and similar softwares, it's not a problem anymore. But a lot of these tasks, the figure, the legends, these are tasks that don't require a lot of concentration. So, for example, in neurosurgery, something that you can easily do in between cases and so forth. And again, a common mistake is that you consider the paper done once you have put your thoughts together in paper, but the truth is that once you have something completed on a manuscript, there is a lot of work of going back and making perfect and changing a word and moving a sentence, deleting a sentence, and so forth. And often, as I said before, it's a back and forth. But what helps me immensely is when I have a product that is close to be done, to read aloud and to make sure that everything is logic and consequential, and to remove any redundancy or anything that is not necessary. Another thing that is very common is that when you start a study, you might be very enthusiastic at the beginning, and then when you go and put in writing, and then you might get to a phase that you start thinking, well, it's really not that great. It was not that worth. I would say don't get discouraged. At least for myself, it's a stage where I go almost for every manuscript that I have written, where at the beginning, I'm very enthusiastic about it. And then once I put all the work and it's done, there is that phase where you start having second thoughts, and you just need to get over it. I think I said pretty much everything I want to say that I thought it was of, sometimes practical importance. I think it's much more important now, Uriel, we go to the discussion if there are any questions, or I'm happy to answer before we all get too tired.
Doctor, yes, we have 4 questions on the chat. Miguel Vargas asking us, Doctor, what lecture or book do you recommend to improve our technical writing?
I don't know of any specific books or lectures. I myself, I have definitely bought different books. I don't think I finished one. As I said, it's the key is to keep it simple. And I think once you take notes and you understand the basic principles which underline every single section of a manuscript, then I would, as I said, I would suggest to study critically, thinking about this scheme, study critically the structure of a few papers on some of the best journals, and that's the best way to learn it.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. We have the next question, Luciana asking you, how do we deal with magazines that are predatory with research?
I don't know, Luciana, what you mean exactly by that, but if you if you are referring to, there are nowadays, we all get email solicitations or invitations saying, oh, I read with interest your paper. I would like for you to submit to this journal. That's something I would say you need to be critical. And nowadays, a lot of these new journals and new magazines, they also appeal to the natural appetite in a way of younger investigators, where you don't have and we all have gone to some extent through these phases, except that years ago there were no such a plethora of opportunities. So I would just say be careful, and also be selective. My suggestion would be, once your time is valuable, so once you decide to invest time into something, it's definitely worth that you invest time with something that potentially can be published in a reasonable journal with a good reputation, rather than spending some time to prepare something that is going to get published, but in a magazine that nobody's going to read.
Thank you, Doctor. I think, Lucero, we in Latin America, we says predatory research for the journals that seems like 50 or 60 papers in one volume, or like it is like a so enterprisal researching. Do you
Yeah, I
know
mean,
what I mean?
again,
Uh-huh.
nowadays, yeah, there are a lot of journals. There is a proliferation of journals
Yeah.
that require you have to pay to publish. So, as I said, the most important thing is your time is valuable, so use it wisely and use it for something that has good quality.
Okay. Great. Lucero Vera asks, Doctor, how can we students improve our scientific experience from undergraduate?
Well, I talked to this about it with my residents on Monday morning, and it's basically it's that why should I do research? I think that the scientific experience is it's different. Some people are fully dedicated to true experimental research, which may or may not have immediate clinical applications. But I think that everyone who is in the medical field can potentially make important observation just by critically observing and analyzing what is under everybody's eyes. I'm sure that during medical school you have studied about acromegaly. And once you see one patient with acromegaly or one patient with Cushing disease, then you are walking outside and you immediately recognize, hey, that person probably has Cushing or that person has acromegaly. You can recognize immediately. Um, but yet, if you think about it, it was not until Pierre Marie in the late 1800 put together a few cases that acromegaly was fully described as a disease. So what I'm saying is that there are a lot of medical facts that are under our eyes just because it's 2022. Don't think that everything has been discovered, everything has been described. There is still a lot to learn, a lot to do. A lot of the things that we do today might not make sense to whoever is going to look at what we are doing 50, 70 years from now. And the other thing is to not to ignore the fact that if you think about it, it's important always, the way research is done nowadays is there is one paper reaches a conclusion and subsequent studies build upon the conclusion reached by somebody else. But if you think about a lot and you study about it, that's why it's important to know the history of medicine, is that if you look at the history of medicine, and you don't need to go back many years, but a lot of important discoveries were often associated with the serendipity. Just read the history of penicillin, how penicillin, which was definitely one of the most important discoveries, how penicillin was identified and described for medical use. Or think about a very simple idea like the Seldinger technique, which was described by Seldinger in a small community hospital in Sweden, has changed the way we do endovascular techniques today. So everybody, I think, can improve upon scientific experience, and it's not only the scientific experience that we might be taught in school or that might be done in major academic centers. Anybody who is curious and knows the history of medicine well enough to understand that a lot of new discoveries are going to come in the future. Everybody can contribute. I'm convinced about that.
Thank you, Doctor. Esteban TV asks, Teacher Lanzino, such an amazing lecture. What advice would you give to the students that we start to investigate from simple things like case reviews?
No, my advice would be to just start observing, and when you have something too interesting, just write it and submit it. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be particularly new, can be an experience that can corroborate a similar experience done in other country. For example, something observed, in Peru can give the readership a, South American perspective about a problem or a series that has already been reported by others in other parts of the world. And the other thing is that if you think about, and we were talking about this the other day with my residents, is everything in science, everything starts with one observation. And therefore, there is a very important difference between 0 and 1. And yet nowadays, because case reports, they bring down journals' impact factors, it's has become very difficult to publish a case report. And if you think about most new observation, they really start with a single case. Now, likely many journals, because they've identified this void, there is a plethora, usually open access journals that accept case reports where they don't care about the impact factor. They want to give a voice to anybody who wants to contribute a single observation, and at the same time comes with the price, because most of these open access journals often require sometimes even substantial fees to get your work published. But again, everybody, I think, can contribute, and I think that there is not a perfect time to start, but I would strongly encourage each one of you to develop very focused, specialized interests, and to continue to cultivate that interest, because I think that's what makes what we do so, intellectually more engaging, and will keep you focused and interest, and will give you the chance, no matter where you are, to truly become in a short period of time the world expert on this particular topic. If you think about, in medicine, it's not that difficult to become the world expert if you select a very niche, very small area, and in a month you turn the literature on that topic upside down, and you study the articles, you read the articles, then you go back and you study them, you go back the third time and you read again critically. In a month you become the world expert on some very focused area of medicine. And the beautiful thing nowadays is that libraries are available worldwide.
Thank you, doctor. I have a question for you. Um, Here we talk a lot about investigation lines, about how beneficial will be for you if you dedicate from your undergrad to this particular investigation line in neurosciences. But will it be beneficial, really beneficial, to dedicate oneself to a single line of research from undergraduate, or should we choose as residents when in residency or in senior?
Yeah, it's actually, we were talking with one of our students about this specific topic earlier on today. I think that you consistency pays off. So if you start very early on a specific interest, of course it will pay off over the years. At the same time, if we are talking about research, what I've seen, and that's one of the mistakes on how some of the research is funded, is that you start with one observation, and then in order to keep getting funded, you are almost obliged to continue on that same path, even though at some point you realize doesn't make any sense. I was wrong years ago. So I don't think that there is a specific model, but I do think that consistency pays off. I know for personal experience that anything you do and you try to do at the highest level, then everything is interesting, everything is exciting. So I would strongly suggest to find your own interest, your own niche. And sometimes it's also important to be realistic. You don't want to become the world experts in a disease that it will be observed once every 10 years. Or you don't want to get, sometimes there are many more opportunities. If you're in a department, there are certain problems that 90% of the people are interested, then you might have a better opportunity just to get focused on something that very few or nobody in your department is especially interested. So I don't think that there is a right or wrong answer to your question. I would suggest find your niche, be passionate about. At the same time, be always flexible. You never know where your professional life is going to take you. You might find that your original area of interest is not taking you anywhere, and it's important to be flexible and be ready to switch and to change to something else.
Thank you, doctor. I have another question too. Yesterday, I was talking with some friends, and they said, okay, they watched the first neurosurgical colloquium, and they knew your mentors too. And they asked me, Uriel, how we can investigate if we have a mentors who does not investigate, who are not investigators, but they are our mentors. How we can do that, or when do we start?
Well, again, you can start. You can easily start on your own. You don't necessarily need with an investigation. My particular experience is, based on the everyday clinical experience. I don't really do true basic research. But I think that sometimes you have to create your own opportunities, and you can just start with reviewing a particular topic about maybe a case that you can encounter in clinic, and that way you start creating your own opportunities. If it's easier if you find the mentors that encourage that particular type of thinking, but I sometimes, human nature, you crave what's not immediate, what's not available, what's not immediately available. And I enjoy, one of the reasons why I enjoy so much the process of medical writing and publishing, even though I work as a clinician, as a doctor every day, full time, is because when I was growing up in Italy, it was very, very difficult. And, I remember just to find some references, you had to spend 2 or 3 days going from library to library. When I came in the United States and I saw that you could do it, the computer for me was like heaven. I said, well, this is so easy. I'm going to be so productive. So don't get discouraged, because sometimes it's important. Sometimes, you get forged by arduous, projects, or and if everything is immediately available, you might not necessarily likely to crave it so much. So just find your own, create your own opportunities, find your own niche, and it can be as easy as an interesting case that you see in clinic or in the hospital that day. And as I said, then you can dig into the literature. And if you're really passionate about, after 1 month, you're the world expert.
Thank you, doctor. Ivan Vega asks, Dr. Lanzino, what do I do if my paper was not accepted by the big magazines? Should I go smaller?
Yeah, that's what I've learned. Sometimes the residents come to me and say they want to send this paper to this journal, and I'm thinking, wow, that's pretty ambitious. It will be rejected, and then boom, the paper is accepted. Other times, I think we have a paper that is going to change the face of medicine, and we have a hard time to get it accepted. So I learned that to some extent, the review process as a random side to it, that I would say if you can afford waiting or wasting the time that it takes, you can always start a little bit higher. And then as the paper is rejected, look at the reasons why it's rejected. Look if through the reviewer's comment, if there is anything that you can truthfully do to improve your paper, and then don't get discouraged and go subsequently to less and less prestigious journals. And usually, more often than not, especially if you make some of the changes that are suggested in the process, you will get something accepted.
Thank you, doctor. Esteban TV asks again, Doctor, when we have to stop evaluating our own manuscripts before sending to the journal? I have a lot of friends who look like 98 times their paper searching for biases or errors before sending to the journals.
Yeah, Esteban, that's a very tricky question, because I also know, when you are writing a manuscript, you cannot be perfectionist to the extreme, because otherwise you're never going to send it. And as I said, at least for me, there is always a stage where I start questioning whether or not what I've written really makes a lot of sense. So I think you have to strike a balance between, you don't want to be superficial, but you also need to refrain from being the perfectionist to an extreme. Otherwise, you're never going to submit anything. And now I found that that balance is that there is one point where I feel I've done enough, and I am reasonably happy with the product, that I'm comfortable to have my name associated with that product when I say, let's send it.
Okay, great, doctor. I would like to comment on a phrase that I could find on a book on scientific writing, that it claims we don't write poetry, we write just to communicate. So thank you for the advice. Lucero Vera asks, Doctor, how can we start to research in vascular neurosurgery?
Well, I think that specifically to how to start research in vascular neurosurgery, then you need to find a senior individual practicing neurosurgeon with a specific interest in vascular, who can provide some guidance. And of course, it's if your purpose is to do research, somebody who has documented and proven expertise and experience in doing research in vascular neurosurgery herself or himself.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lanzino. And the last question from Janet Selenita Cruz. Doctor, I need an advice. How can I choose a good research advisor?
Well, Janet, I would say that the important elements are somebody who has passion for what they're doing. Somebody who, never feels that what they're doing is, it's work or it's a bother. It's, that they really enjoy doing what they're doing. It helps to have, role models that are, charismatic, that they make you wanna be like them. It's important to get associated with people that are integrity, and they also take the time to advise and to mentor younger individual. In other words, sometimes it's better to be part of a smaller laboratory with a advisor, might not be necessarily the best known person in the field, as opposed to the world famous advisor who barely knows the members of their own team. So I think it's a combination of different, but definitely passion and somebody who is willing to invest the time to be an advisor. Those are probably the best, the two most important factors I would look for.
Thank you, doctor. And doctor, how can we be more conscious with plagiarism and bias? In recent years, many investigations have fallen and stained the name of the researchers for plagiarism and bias.
Well, I think, nowadays, first of all, avoid it in the first place. And be careful. Second of all, nowadays, before there are many, so you mean how not to do yourself, or how to make sure nobody else is copying your work?
No, how you don't do it to yourself.
Yeah, and the other thing is that I would think it's pretty much uh, nowadays is routine. If you don't do, a journal will run your manuscript through a software. So there are plenty of widely available software. So make sure that you screen the manuscript yourself. But if you have not done it, then you don't have to worry about. But if the issue is more complicated, because, for example, quite often we are writing about series, or we're looking at one aspect about a cohort that we have collected over the years and on which we have already published about a different aspect. So it can be very difficult not to plagiarize yourself, especially in the material and method session, because there is so many words that you can use to describe your own material and method. So I think it's a combination. First, don't do it, and second, there are plenty of softwares that they will analyze your work and they will tell you what kind of overlap exists with other work and what those works are.
We are so very thankful, doctor. We don't have more questions. Thank you. Would you
Thank you
like
very
to
much.
would you like to give a last word, please?
No, I thank you for this. Is something that it's very commendable as initiative what you are doing, and it's great to see the interest and the participation. As far as myself, I'm honored to be part of this, and because I know that many of the younger colleagues that are on the line will be leaders of their own in their own specialties in the future. So it's great for me to be able to be part of this, and I welcome any suggestion about future topics if I can be of any help. And again, I enjoy particularly the discussion and the questions at the end, because I think that's the most, probably the most valuable part, and I'm looking forward to the next one. And again, and I think, Uriel, I can also speak for yourself. We welcome any suggestion on any specific topic. This is something that we are happy to do it for the audience, and not doing for ourselves. So,
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Giuseppe Lanzino. Great advices. I think many of the attendees smiled when they saw that they did what is not recommended to do. Undoubtedly, some tips that are taken into account to take home and that will be remembered when writing our investigations. Thank you very much, Professor, for the desire to teach us and support the mission we have with the generations to come. And yes, of course, if anyone would like to suggest a topic of our next symposium, we are open to support and learn, and we will consider that suggestions. So thank you, everyone. Thank
thanks.
you, Dr. Lanzino. See you in forward.
Bye.
Goodbye. Hasta luego a todos. Nos vemos. Nos vemos. Un abrazo. Bye, everyone.